I think there were a few things, three reasons I decided to write this book. One, after the raid in Abbottabad, it was only in the late 2017 that all the documents in bin Laden's compound were released. The most useful document was a 228-page diary in handwritten in Arabic, which was a bin Laden family journal. And it really recorded the discussions in the bin Laden family about how to respond to the Arab Spring, which was a bit of a dilemma for them because they understood that this was incredibly important events in the Middle East, yet bin Laden's ideas were absent, so were his followers. And they met every night for dinner, and they thought these discussions were so important, they recorded them in this diary. So I relied on that diary. Nadia Awaidat, you may know her, Michael, helped me kind of translate and decipher it, because it wasn't written for publication, it was written as an internal family document. And they were using it bin Laden was supposed to deliver a big speech about the Arab Spring, and they were using it to think through what was happening, get his reactions, talk about the big speech he would deliver. So that's one example of the documents that came out of the Abbottabad compound. And there were a bunch, there were 6,000 pages of useful material that came out. Somebody else you may, Nelly Lahoud, you may know, Michael, is writing what will be the definitive book on the documents. So, going through that, bin Laden never expected these documents to fall into enemy hands. There are a mix of documents. Some of them are 40-page memos he was writing to his subordinates. Some of them are shorthand written notes he was sending to his wife or wives. So it's a mix of personal and political. And that was kind of the key. These documents began to be released in 2012, and they only finally released in 2017. So that's a whole branch of new material that didn't exist before I wrote my other books. Then, we continue to get very interesting material. I'll give you an example. Abu Jandal, who was one of key bin Laden bodyguard, he wrote a book in French. I think it came out in 2012, and that was translated into English in 2014. That is a very useful window into bin Laden's thinking, because Jandal was close to him and spent a lot of time with him before 9/11. There was a very interesting account by Abdul Badaji, written in 1991 in Arabic. It was published in Riyadh or in Jeddah. And it's a contemporaneous account of the Afghan Arabs in Afghanistan, written long before anybody knew who they were or had paid any attention to them. And it's an authoritative document because Abdul Badaji, he wrote under a pseudonym. He knew all the players, he interviewed them, he had transcripts of materials from the battlefield. And he also is critical of what the Afghan Arabs did. And so this is another really interesting document, set of documents. So there just seemed to be a lot more material. And then a lot more authoritative material has come out in recent years. I had also interviewed a lot of people over the years about bin Laden, and a lot of them are now dead. Abu Musab al-Suri, I spent a lot of time with in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and London. Jamal Khalifa, his brother-in-law, was murdered in Madagascar in 2007. I spent a lot of time with him. Bin Laden, of course, himself, of course, is dead. Salman al-Auda is in prison and under a death sentence in Saudi Arabia. Khalid al-Fawaz, who was bin Laden's guy in London, is serving a life sentence in a maximum security jail. So the point is that a lot of the people I spoke to are no longer accessible. And in different ways, they were all very useful in my thinking about bin Laden. I've spent most of my career focused on him and people in Al-Qaeda. And so I thought it was time with the 20th anniversary to do a book. I teach students at Arizona State University, and they weren't alive on 9/11. For them, 9/11 is like the Korean War for me. It's something that happened, even the Vietnam War for me, I was 10 when the war finished, or at least the American withdrew in 72. So I have like some vague kind of, but for these kids in university or Americans joining the military, this has really entered into history. And so one of my students asked me, what's the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? I thought, well, hey, that's actually a very interesting question. And there's quite a lot to say about that. So that's a very long way of saying the reason I decided to write it now was we're far enough away from his death 10 years ago. We're far enough away from 9/11. So much material is entered into the public domain that you can actually write about him. I mean, if you think about what we knew about bin Laden on 9/11, we knew very little about him, really. I mean, he was he didn't say anything personal in any of the interviews that he did. His family wasn't saying anything about him or anybody in the family. And as you know, Saudi Arabia is one of the most closed societies in the world, maybe a little less closed now, but still very close. So there was just not much known. And Al-Qaeda was a secret organization on 9/11. Secretly, people didn't know who was in Al-Qaeda. Well, as you may recall, there was 6 weeks. There was a pause of 6. He didn't get automatically appointed. He was the Saif al-Adil became the interim leader, who's the military commander. So he wasn't immediately appointed the leader. Zawahiri is not particularly well liked by people in the organization. He's not a likable guy. He hasn't been a very effective leader since his appointment. But it is, it is interesting the extent to which bin Laden he wasn't involved in the planning of any of the big anti-American attacks, the embassy attacks, the Cole attack, 9/11. He wasn't involved in any of the big strategic decisions, attacking the United States. This wasn't Zawahiri's idea. So to me, this is all interesting stuff that it became clearer to me over time. Even 4 years after 9/11, 5 years after 9/11, I began to see that Zawahiri's role had been exaggerated, including by myself, by the way. But we now have the very interesting discussions with Abu Hafs al-Masri, who was he was basically the liaison in some ways between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. He wrote the Emirate Arab language magazine for the Taliban. He says that he says that bin Laden, Zawahiri was pretty marginal. Abu Jandal, who I mentioned, the bodyguard, says, I mean, it's not my opinion. I'm basing it on a lot of first-person testimonies. Montasser al-Zayat, who's an Egyptian lawyer who spent a lot of time in prison with Zawahiri, says, and also a lot of the Americans who were really following bin Laden had the same view that Zawahiri was kind of a marginal player. And it makes sense that he was a marginal player because if you look back at the history, when Zawahiri was in jail in Dagestan, a lot of people forget, 97, because he was trying to get to Chechnya and he was picked up by the Russians. And so in this crucial period when they were planning the embassy attacks, he was actually physically in jail. He gets out of jail, he comes to Afghanistan. The Taliban have appointed bin Laden the leader of all the Arabs in Afghanistan. Zawahiri is a penniless refugee with like a few followers. Some people say 5, some people say 7, some people say 10. Yeah, and bin Laden's got Al-Qaeda and thousands of people. So their whole power dynamic shifted over time, and Zawahiri just wasn't kind of a key player. I mean, if there was real key players in Al-Qaeda, it was the 2 Egyptian military commanders of Al-Qaeda, one of whom was died in Lake Victoria in Kenya in an accident in 1996, and the other one was Abu Hafs, who was killed in a U.S. airstrike after 9/11. So those were the people who really were. And Zawahiri was never a fighter. Al-Qaeda is a military organization in its own mind. Zawahiri's never been a military guy. Yes, he was involved in revolutionary activities in Egypt, but he wasn't. There's no record of him fighting in Afghanistan. He wasn't considered a mujahid by people like Abdullah Anas, the son-in-law of Abdullah Razam. Jamal Khashoggi also didn't consider him to be anything other than a guy just who was sitting in Peshawar as a doctor. It's like making the argument, did the Japanese win the war against the United States because suddenly a lot of Americans are driving Japanese cars? I mean, I don't, it was bin Laden didn't anticipate anything of what actually happened. This was not his plan. So he hasn't, the jihadis in general have won with this terrible decision to just pull out quickly out of Afghanistan. But that's not bin Laden's victory. This is the Taliban's victory. Obviously, who are still linked with Al Qaeda and other groups in Afghanistan, like the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba. There was a discussion of U.S. Navy SEALs asked a lawyer who was, can we, what are the rules of engagement? And the lawyer said, look, if he conspicuously surrenders and comes out with his hands up and he's not, he's wearing his pajamas, you can't kill him. So that was the instruction. Of course, the attack happened at the middle of the night. There was no electricity in the neighborhood. Bin Laden didn't conspicuously surrender. He didn't put up a fight either. So, but there were certainly plans to capture him. There was a whole set of plans that if he was captured, they would take him to the Bagram Air Base, and he would then be interrogated. If the operation was still secret, he would just be kept there for, if no one knew that the operation had happened, and bin Laden was taken to Bagram, they would have interrogated him for a long time. But obviously, he got killed that night, as did his two bodyguards, as did his son, as did one of the bodyguards' wives. There's no evidence they did, and it's hard to prove negatives, but we have thousands of pages of these secret documents that are now public and that anybody can look at. And bin Laden wasn't corresponding with a Pakistani military officer or a Pakistani civil servant. Bin Laden was hiding from people on his compound, by the way. One of the bodyguards' wives did not know that it was bin Laden who was living there. So, why would he tell the Pakistanis? Don't forget that Al Qaeda tried to kill Musharraf on 2 occasions with very serious assassination attempts. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 operational commander, was handed over by the Pakistanis to the Americans. So there was, Pakistan is a very chaotic country, with 200 million plus people. Sometimes when people ask me this question, I point to a guy called Whitey Bulger. I don't know if you know who Whitey Bulger is, but he killed a number of people in Boston. Well, he disappeared in the United States for 20 years and was only discovered in California 20 years later, despite the fact that he was on the FBI's most wanted list, and despite the fact that the United States is has a pretty efficient law enforcement mechanism. Pakistan is a great place to disappear, and in a city like Abbottabad, there was Pashtun Afghans coming in, setting up compounds. Bin Laden didn't really attract a lot of attention. The Bin Laden compound, it's not, people say, hey, it was this really big palace and different, and it's not that much different. I actually went there. It got inside the compound. It's only a little bit bigger than some of its neighbors, and it's a sort of middle class, upper middle class neighborhood in Abbottabad. Not the best neighborhood, but they didn't. The fact that they were kind of not being kind of secretive, the neighbors thought that was kind of maybe a little odd, but lots of people are secretive, and lots of people protect their women with these walls and protecting, and have women living in sort of in purdah, as it were. So they did not attract a great deal of attention, and there's no evidence that when you say they must have known, that's very different from they did know. I mean, must is different than did, and bear in mind the CIA, which had very strong reason to try and find bin Laden, for 10 years they had no idea where he was. So, and they were really looking for him. The Pakistanis were not looking for him. And actually, one of the documents that I drew on, which was very, very interesting, Al Jazeera got hold of the 220-page, maybe 300-page Abbottabad Commission, And this is a very interesting document because it's very critical to the Pakistani government on two issues. One, their response to the night of the raid, which was super incompetent. They had no idea what was going on. And two, the fact that they had no idea that bin Laden was living in. And they interviewed 200 plus people. It was conducted by four, kind of leading Pakistani kind of former government people. And Al Jazeera got a leaked copy of the report and published it. And it gives you a pretty good understanding of how bin Laden was living, where he lived. He went into Kunar for the first, after Tora Bora, he went into Kunar, which is a very interesting decision because that was not where people expected him to go. Everybody thought he'd go into Pakistan. Kunar is heavily mountainous, heavily forested, mountainous, very remote part of Afghanistan. Great place to disappear. He spent a year there. Then he went to Peshawar, a big city. Very quickly moved into Swat, where he had his second child with his fifth wife. Swat is a kind of romantic place, the Switzerland of Pakistan. Then he went to Haripur, which is an obscure city. His wife had she had two kids there. They pretended that she was deaf and dumb because why would a woman from Yemen be having kids in an obscure provincial Pakistani city? And then he spent 5.5 years in Abbottabad. So, and she had two kids in Abbottabad as well. So bin Laden had 4 kids while he was on the run, which is kind of unusual for most fugitives. Don't have they don't bring their families with them. B, they certainly don't have 4 kids. But for the people of the CIA who are following him most closely, the fact that bin Laden, when they identified the compound, there was a mysterious third family. The fact that it was large and had multiple wives and multiple kids, the people who'd really been tracking bin Laden said, oh, well, that's interesting, because they thought bin Laden would be with his family, or as much of them as possible. And of course, that was what happened. Al-Qaeda was mostly destroyed after 9/11. Not completely. They trained British Pakistani citizens to carry out the London attacks, July 7th, 2005, which killed 52 commuters. So that was Al-Qaeda. It kind of regrouped in the tribal areas in Pakistan. But it's largely gone. And one of the themes in the documents from Abbottabad is bin Laden saw the drone program was really destroying much of his organization. And he was well aware that his organization was not doing well, but he continued to have fantasies that they could kind of kill Obama or kill Petraeus, or said, don't bother with Joe Biden because he's not significant. He said, don't bother with Biden. He's unprepared to be president, which I thought was sort of an interesting aside. But Al-Qaeda today is a local jihadi group in Afghanistan, Pakistan. It has affiliates in Yemen and Somalia to some degree, and North Africa. And these affiliates, sometimes they do better. Like Al-Qaeda in Yemen at one point controlled a lot of sort of the Hadramaut area that they don't anymore. Al-Shabaab in Somalia controlled a lot of Somalia. It doesn't anymore. Al-Qaeda in North Africa is sort of a kidnapping organization and doesn't really control territory. So I'd say today, Al-Qaeda is, not doing well, led by the ineffective Ayman al-Zawahiri. It obviously has the al-Sham or the various different Syria kind of components of Al-Qaeda. These are local jihadi groups. But I think the Taliban controlling Afghanistan is good for Al-Qaeda. And they never really separated. According to the United Nations report issued in June, because of intermarriage, they're closely aligned and maybe closer than ever. They're going to start regrouping in Afghanistan, but it's not like the pre-9/11 Afghanistan in the sense that the United States can certainly carry out drone strikes relatively simply. But they're going to sort of regroup, and they're going to do what ISIS did in Syria and Iraq, which is attract people from Europe, from the Middle East. They've already attracting people from Pakistan, from Central Asia. They're going to get training. They're going to try and do things in their home countries. They're going to inspire people at their computers in Paris or Ohio or Munich, because the Taliban will declare their emirate. People will get excited, say the jihadis won. It may not be exactly like ISIS's caliphate. There are, of course, differences, but their similarities are more important than their differences. And so, if we'd had this conversation 4 weeks ago, I wouldn't have had the same exact response. But because but I think that this provides another big lease of life for these groups. None of them are very strong, but they prey on weak hosts, or they sometimes have a government. I mean, for the first time in a long time, they have a government that is actually favorable to them. In Iraq, they overthrew the government essentially in much of the parts they controlled, and then they prey on failed or failing states and weak hosts. So yeah, I think this is good for them. I mean, there's no doubt about it.